Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Aquarius Rising Africa. And good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever in the beautiful world you are. I hope you're having a good time. I noticed in my earlier show, my internet was hanging a little bit. So I hope it's okay. But I seem to be able to hear myself okay. Just come out of some hectic storms and huge damages here, so things are still kind of balancing themselves out. So yeah, but Dr. Dennis is here. So without any further ado, we're going to be talking about the Isle of the Dead. Yeah, the Isle of the Dead tonight. And as Dr. Dennis described, one of the freakiest nights of his life. Dr. Dennis, how are you?
All right, how's everything going over that way? Finally made it through the storms and all the power outages and all that. Definitely, you know what? When that happened, it reminded me of that old saying: "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." So,
for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, no, it's quite an intense experience. But yeah, for me, it's more about the damages and of course the animals. You see so much hectic stuff.
I kind of feel for you because I've been in that situation myself several times with a lot of the. We sort of live where there are sometimes we have some hurricane residue. We don't mostly get the full blown hurricane, but we get the outspects of it, and that's bad enough. But when you don't really realize how much dependent you are on the technology until it's not there for a while. That's the way it goes. And it's very much like I've told people that, you never know how much you have until you start moving in. You move from one place to another. It's amazing. Where did all this stuff come from? And that's the way it goes with power outages. Where's my power at? What am I doing without it? And we are very unfortunately dependent upon these things, and we are slaves to our technology, unfortunately. And that's a bad thing in a way, but it's good to have it. It's amazing, our great grandparents didn't worry that much about the things that we worry about today. They lived in a completely different world. But
Totally.
yeah,
well, that's part of the thing that was so interesting actually is because, of course, I grew up on the farm in desert area, semi-desert area. We didn't have power. We didn't have TV or phones or internet, anything. And at nighttime, the generator came on for a couple of hours. So it was pretty much exactly like that. Very interesting. And when there's no electrical hum in the air, it's actually really nice. And so there's a lot of good that comes out of these situations as well. But anyway, I'm looking forward to hearing about the freakiest night of your life.
Yes, it was one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. Believe me, I've been in some very dark areas in this world, and this was one of the most freakiest nights. And we put it that way. It was very strange. I want to say this: the reason I call it the Isle of the Dead today is there is a very famous painting. I cannot think of the artist. I know his name. I can't think of it right offhand, but it's called the Isle of the Dead, and it represents, the afterlife. Kind of when you cross the veil, you're waiting to enter into this Isle of the Dead, and it's a very striking painting. And it was actually, here's the weird thing about it. I actually have a print of it on my wall, and it also, was actually the favorite painting of Adolf Hitler. And you can see pictures of him with it on his wall behind him in his office or behind his desk. It's freaky. But I got, I've often admired that painting. And I hope he and I didn't have the same kind of taste and stuff. But anyway, that's really, really weird.
What was the significance of him having that painting? I mean, as far as I know, Hitler was a great artist, right? He was a great artist. He was very creative. He wanted to be an architect. So
he was very creative in that way. Definitely, he was a pretty good artist. I've seen some of his work. Some of his work still exists. Adolf Hitler was Minimal paintings. He was more like experimenting with stuff. I think painting wise, but he also tried to do some recreations on that. But this was a painting by the artist itself, and I think that's kind of strange that he and I would admire the same painting. But anyway, that kind of makes me feel kind of weird about that. But anyway, the Isle of the Dead. I'm gonna lay this out for everyone today. Now, back in my career many years ago when I first started, I was definitely into cryptids and stuff like that. It was one of my very first cases was actually a werewolf thing. But I also got deep into what I call spiritual research, and a lot of people call it ghost hunting. I never considered myself a ghost hunter, but I call it spiritual research because you run into some things other than ghosts sometimes in this. And the interesting aspect of it all is that when this happened, and this happened back about, I guess this has been about 20 some odd years ago. Now, I live in the upstate of South Carolina, which is the state right down below North Carolina, north and south. And I live in the upstate, which is very close to the hills and the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And here we have one of the largest man-made lakes in the world. It is called Lake Hartwell. It is as big as an ocean, almost. And it also covers two states. It goes into South Carolina, and it's also in the Georgia side. It goes over into Georgia. And the name of this lake is Hartwell Lake. And it is named after, by the way, part of Georgia, which is Hartwell, Georgia. Well, where I'm at, I'm across the border in South Carolina, but this is a very large lake. And the reason I'm laying this out is because this lake was made, and it was very much like the Tennessee Valley Authority. I don't know if people out there are familiar with that, but they came in and flooded this area. And this all happened back in the early and mid 50s, 1950s. It's been a long time ago. It was before my time, put it that way. And anyway, when they did that, they flooded a lot of towns. There were a lot of old towns and stuff like that. And one area that they flooded which is very close to where I live. And of course, there's a lot of recreation on this lake now. There's a lot of marinas and boating going on and all that. It is one of the very premier place for, enjoying yourself out on the water or whatever. I've swam in it. I've been there many times. I've camped on the shores of this lake. And people don't realize when they visit this lake that there are actual towns up under this water that were flooded out. People, they came in and bought all this stuff out and flooded it. And under one section of this lake, there is a town, and it is actually called the Old Andersonville. That was the name of it. And it was sort of between South Carolina and Georgia, kind of almost on the border. And that town got flooded out completely. And there were a lot of, in that area, old Southern plantations. And one of these plantations was in that situated area. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because when they flooded this, parts of the higher hills and stuff remained as islands in this lake. Okay, now that's why I'm laying this out for everybody today. So the island that I went to, the island I'm talking about today, is really like a big hill in the middle of this lake that was part of this community. And when they flooded it out and all that, on this hill was a cemetery, a graveyard. And it was a very interesting graveyard because it is not just a community type graveyard or even a churchyard. A lot of people don't realize, Shanty, there's a big difference between a graveyard and a cemetery. Graveyards or churchyards usually are associated with churches, and cemeteries usually mean they're public cemeteries. They're not attached to a church, okay, in that respect. But this was that way. This was really an old churchyard. And it was partly also a family graveyard that was attached to a plantation that was near there. And this plantation, if I remember correctly, was owned by a Harris, the family named Harris. And part of this graveyard was part of their family graveyard, but you also had a kind of a public graveyard with it. And the reason I bring this up is because this plantation, they had slaves back in the old days, and some of the slaves were buried in this graveyard. on this island as well. That's why I'm bringing this up and let everybody know what the situation was. When I heard about this, a lot of people call this island Ghost Island, okay, because they say weird lights are seen on it. Really strange things. People said they've tried to camp there and got run off that night. Weird things began to happen. Well, of course, you know me. As soon as I heard this, hey, I've got to check this out. I got to, investigate this, and it sounded very interesting. If you run into a legend like that, And so I said, well, I'll tell you what. I kind of formed a plan. I would like to spend the night on this island and see what happens. And so I had some friends who had a boat, and they said, they were kind of going on. So you don't, you're not brave enough to do it. I said, just put me on that island and come back and get me next day. I'll be ready to get over here then. I won't spend the night by myself on this island and see what happens. And little did I know what I was truly letting myself in for at that time. I might would have changed my mind on that. But anyway, it was a very interesting concept I had on that. So I said, I will kind of just camp out all, that night and see what happens. Because there are a lot. And at this time, I was fascinated with the concept of what we call ghost lights. These are lights that are seen at crossroads in cemeteries and certain areas, what we call liminal places. Now, a liminal place can be very much like a mountain pass or crossroad or battlefields. These are places where supposedly spirits are seen. Weird stuff like that happens, And the liminal means in between worlds, a place that's sort of in between life and death and the worlds itself, different dimensions or however you want to look at it. So this was definitely, absolutely in my book, a liminal place that I wanted to check out. And when I heard the history of the place, that it was partly a plantation type thing, an old family graveyard, and also partly and they say that if you dive in the lake next to this island, you can go down in the water, you will see a church down underneath the water. And according to legend, that certain times around midnight or something, you will hear the bell ring in this church underwater. And they said this was attached to the legend of Ghost Island, the Isle of the Dead, is that when this bell rang, spirits would rise out of the graveyard and the cemetery and all that. So definitely I'll be keeping an ear out for the midnight bell from this church, buried deep under the water. And so I said, that was the plan. I said, you leave me here I got there about like maybe an hour, 45 minutes before sundown. And I remember, it was the fall of the year. I remember I had on a leather jacket because it was kind of chilly. And all I brought with me was I brought a snack, of course, for later on that night, or some sandwich or something. And I had a lantern. And also, in case something went wrong, I suppose I had a walkie-talkie to call my friends in case I wanted to leave the island. They wouldn't leave me. I didn't ask for the walkie-talkie, but they said, no, you got to keep that because something happens, you need to call us. Because they were going to drop me off there and go back to the mainland, okay, and to their house. They had a house on the lake, actually. And so I was going to be there alone, all by myself all night on the Isle of the Dead. And so when I got there, I walked around, explored a little bit, and sure enough, it was full of old graves. There were, I think, a couple of mausoleums that were there, a lot of headstones, crosses. I remember there was one Celtic-looking cross that was there. And I went around, I've always been interested in graveyards because they're sort of like a history book. They tell you different things about, especially the community that was there and all that. And I was very interested in that because a lot of this was attached, supposedly to the Civil War, things that happened back then. I'm a big history buff. You know me, I like history. And this was another opportunity to touch history a little bit, So anyway, I walked around and looked the rest of, while the sun was still shining a little bit, walked around, looked at all the headstones. And so I found one situated place where I could see the lake, and yet I was sitting almost in the middle of the cemetery. Now, the cemetery was not, like that big. It was not a huge cemetery, but it was a pretty good sized cemetery, what was left of it. And there had been, I could see some vandalism a little bit, that had gone on there. A lot of beer cans laying around, people coming to do whatever they do out there. So I made myself a little camp. Like I was facing the lake, but I was right in the middle. I'm just telling everybody how I was situated here, so that I could see the lake. Anyway, as the sun began to go down, I got myself situated, made a little campfire there. Had a little campfire going, and had that lantern. I had one lantern, which was an electric lantern. It was not a kerosene lantern. It was a sort of electric lantern, but it was a battery run. And I just said I'll keep that for when it gets really dark, because I had the fire going pretty good. So I'm sitting there and watching the sun go down. And as I did, and with that, I noticed that a feeling came over me that I had never felt before. And it wasn't a feeling of isolation, although that was part of it. Completely cut off from everything, because there were no lights. There were no street lights that I could see. Way off down the lake, I could see them across the lake, But or maybe people's porch lights they were on, or their dock lights. But there weren't that many of that. I felt there was a very extreme feeling of isolation, but also something else that it put me on edge a little bit. And I'm not saying I got nervous or anything, and I don't usually get nervous in those kind of situations. I usually have been one person that could always control their fear. And believe me, I've been in some very fearful situations in my time, and that included law enforcement as well. And I've always tried to keep control of my, situation, whatever it might be. And everybody has fear. Everybody can get fear, but I've always had an attitude about fear is to make it work for you. Don't let it conquer you. You conquer your fear. That's the way to do it. If you ever have that kind of situation, so I began to feel kind of uneasy as the sun started going down, and I was sitting there and all alone and isolated. And to top it all off, like out of a movie, this gradually I noticed a fog coming in over the lake, and I said, okay, that's all I need tonight is the fog, and the fog was pretty thick. I could see it rolling up, just like you see in some horror movie, this fog come rolling in. And then I really felt cut off because I could not even see the lake that much anymore. I could only see, and there I was sitting in the middle of this fog at night with a campfire in the middle of a cemetery. And that's when I've noticed things began to happen. As soon as the sun got down, the birds were kind of singing a little bit. I mean, there were a lot of sounds, crickets, frogs, you could hear there. As soon as the fog came in, everything seemed to stop. Everything got quiet, and so I began to get a little bit uneasy about that, and it was very strange, and it gave me more of that feeling of isolation, kind of cut off feeling, and like I was just stuck in the middle of a cloud or something because of this fog. But I could see it wasn't that thick where I was at. It was just like thick around me, but I could still see the tombstones and the mausoleum. I think it was one mausoleum to my right on the left side of me that I could still make out in the corner of. I could still see pretty good, especially where the firelight went, around me. And like I said, I did not have that big of a campfire going, but it was, enough to light it up. So about this time, I get the sandwich out and I eat supper, and it's probably about an hour after sundown. And that's when I began to notice something. I began to see shadows out of my peripheral vision, things moving where they shouldn't have been moving, because where I was at, there were no trees. There were no big trees that much on this island. I mean, there were pretty good sized trees, but not like giant oak trees or anything. There might have been one further back, and the island was not that huge. But there were a lot of bushes around, and some on the outskirts of this cemetery. But the cemetery itself, it looked like it might have one time been cleaned or kept clean by certain people or whatever the situation. But I could still see those tombstones. And behind the tombstones, every now and then, it was like I would catch a glimpse of something moving. Well, I began to say, is this just my eyes? Is this the fog? Is this the firelight doing this to me, Because I have noticed, Shanty, in a lot of investigations I've done over the years, you will encounter things of what I call, quick shadows. things that move off your peripheral vision. And you got to look at them and you say, did I see that? Because you don't really get a good look at whatever it is that's moving. And that is really unnerving in itself when you see this happen. But this began to happen more than I've ever known that to happen. That's why I'm bringing that up. I began to notice these shadows that were moving around me. And here's the weird thing. About this time, and it was getting probably around maybe an hour or so, maybe a couple hours right before midnight. And I was getting ready to listen for that bell, supposedly it was supposed to happen, that you could hear ringing. This began to get more profound. I began to see things moving like in the fog themselves. And here I began to hear footsteps, like, and it was like crunch, crunch, crunch. And the footsteps began on the outside of the darkness, deeper into the fog. And I could not see anything, deep into that. But I could hear them moving around me. And one minute they would be at my back. The next minute they'd be in front of me and then at my side. And it was like they were surrounding me or walking. Very much like somebody outside of my circle of light walking in the darkness of that fog around me. Well, that began to be very freaky, okay? And I said, am I imagining this? And you doubt in certain circumstances like that, you do doubt your senses sometimes, especially when you're kind of cut off and isolated like that, by yourself.
Wow.
I've noticed that in certain other situations I've been in when you see something, and I tell people about this. A lot of this stuff that can fool your eyes sometimes because the brain is always looking to put images there sometimes. You got to remember the brain wants to find something, a pattern or an image or something. And you got to be very careful about that. And I warn people about that. But if you ever see something like that and you don't know if it's really what you're seeing, you can change your perspective. In other words, you can move the angle of your head or the angle of how you're sitting and see if you still see it. And see if it's still showing up. That will tell you whether it's a trick of your eyes or your mind doing that, or whether there is something really there, that's doing that. And so that's what I did. I changed my seating arrangement, and I looked out further into the graveyard, and it's still doing it. It's still going on. Those shadows are still moving around me. And then I look at my watch. I remember it's like a little bit after midnight. I didn't hear any bell, by the way. I'm kind of disappointed about that. I didn't hear any bell. But I noticed a little bit after midnight, and this is when it gets really freaky. I began to hear something like whispers, like people whispering out there in the dark. And not only now am I hearing footsteps and seeing stuff moving, but now I'm hearing whispers. And they're very indistinct words. I can't make out any words, but it's like people whispering to each other. Oh, you're there, you're there. And it's carrying, but it's still carrying on the wind. And there's a little bit of a wind, not enough to blow the fog away, but it's a little bit of a breeze, and it's cold now. And I noticed it's getting very chilly, kind of. And I'm wondering, is that the effect of the water? Or is that something else going on here? Because in a lot of my cases in my lifetime, in my career, I have actually had cold spots show up out of nowhere. I remember one time I was in a garage in a very warm garage. It had no ventilation at all to it, and felt a cold spot come up to me. I'll have to tell you that story sometime. I call it the case of the witch's remains. It was a very freaky case that I had. But we experienced that. This cold spot walked up to us, and you could put your hand in it and feel the difference between where I was sitting in the cold spot itself. I mean, a very drastic difference. And I began to wonder, is this just the weather kind of a thing going on here? Or is it something supernatural? Yeah. So this is getting really freaky now, And so the fire is kind of getting lower, and I've run out of fuel. I didn't have a whole big bunch of firewood, to work with. So I said, I'm going to shortly be here in the dark. With nothing, with no light except for my lantern, which I didn't want to use my lantern because it had batteries, and I didn't want it, in case I needed it for anything or to signal a boat or whatever. I wanted to keep it in reserve, So the fire was beginning to die down, And as it did, Shanty, honest to gosh, the whispers got louder. The footsteps got closer. The shadows began to move more around me. And like I say, they were indistinct. It wasn't making out a form of any kind. It wasn't like a head or legs or arm, but they were just like things moving in the shadows. And I kept saying, is this really a trick of my eyes doing this? I still couldn't figure out what was doing that. And I said, well, what I've got to do then is walk out into this fog and look more into the shadows and see if I can see this more. Okay. Now, this is when it's about like 3 o'clock in the morning now. Okay. And this is when things get really, really freaky here and began to make me think that what was happening was not just my eyes playing tricks on me or my mind playing tricks on me. I walked out into the fog. Now, the fog was kind of chilly, like I say, a clammy fog, and I walked out a little bit more because it wasn't that close around me where I was at. It might have been the fire doing it or whatever. I stepped out into this darkness that was around me. And as I did, the really freaky part is, like I said, it was clammy and it was cold, but not icy, bone-chilling cold, but it was cold, and a little bit colder like. And like I said, that could have been an effect from a lake effect kind of a thing, going on. Or was it something else? Because I know that there have been certain instances when I've run into supernatural entities and things that temperature drops happen. Okay. And so I walk on out into the darkness and I start circling around where I was at. And as I circle, I had to be careful because I didn't want to fall over any tombstones or anything like that. And in the dark, I stopped for a few minutes because I got, it's kind of dark and I can still see my fire dying, And I stopped. I remember doing this, stopping by a rather large tombstone. And I put my hand on the tombstone and I'm standing there and it's still every now and then the whispers, And now I began to feel like something trying to touch me. And the first thing I feel is like something on the back of the neck, just like somebody would take a hand and brush your neck, kind of a feeling. So that's when I turned around and I spoke to the darkness. I said, look, is there anybody here that wants to communicate with me? Is there anybody here that's trying to tell me something? Do you want something? Do you want to communicate something to me? And the weird thing was the whispers kind of picked up a little bit louder. Okay. But like I said, they weren't just completely continuously whispering. It was now like every now and then you would hear a whisper, but they were louder and closer. It was almost as if whatever was out there in the dark was walking up to me and getting closer, And I remember I had my hand on that tombstone and I was standing there and all of a sudden, and I swear this happened, it was like somebody put a hand down on top of my hand. And it was not a good feeling, okay? It was kind of a cold, clammy kind of a feeling, okay? They put their hand down on my hand, and I did not move. And I looked down at my hand, there's nothing there that I can see, except my hand on the tombstone. And so I began to move my hand like away from the tombstone, and it felt just like, somebody was trying to hold my hand, trying to take my hand. And that's when I spoke again. And I said, do you want to talk? Do you something you want to tell me here? Is there something you want to convey to me? Speak to me. Let me see you. Come out of the dark and let me see you, And while I'm standing there now, I began to see something in the fog. Now, like I say, I'm still going, is this my eyes playing tricks on me or what? But it began to be like a shape. Okay. And the shape, I'm not going to say was a woman, but it was feminine looking to me. I'm not going to say for sure if that was what it was. Okay. But it was like a shape, almost like a silhouette. Okay. But I could not see any distinct stuff to it. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see hair. I couldn't see anything like that because it's in the fog and I cannot see and I don't have enough light. I'm thinking if I'd have put the light on it at that time, what would have happened? It probably would have went away. That's the way I've had that happen in certain instances. One night, I was attacked by a demonic entity that way. And as soon as I put a light on it, it was gone. These things a lot of times cannot stand light. So if you ever get in that situation, my friends, and you think you're facing a demon, turn your flashlight on him or something, because they do not like actual physical light. Okay, that's the way they just kind of shy away from that. And so I began to wonder if I would have put my light on that, would I see it? You know, and it was very freaky, and it was almost like it was coming towards me, but not, but still. And here's the freaky thing about it: it was like coming closer and then going away, coming closer and then kind of going back again. You know, it was just like it was swaying in this fog. You know, that was really weird.
Wow.
So I said, "Hey, I'm going to walk up to it." You know, now a lot of people here at this point say, "Dennis, didn't you want to run?" I say, "No, no, I wanted to see more of it. I wanted to experience more of it.
Yeah.
You're not going to get anywhere if you run. You know." I have never run from anything in my life. If you ever see me running, Shandy, you might want to run too. Okay, but anyway, uh, that's the way that goes. But that was freaky. So I said, I got to step. So I stepped closer, and here's the weird thing: the closer I got to this thing, the further back it would leave to go away from me. So it was playing with me. Okay. And I said, oh, wait a minute now. I'm not going to fall for this, because if you know the old legends of ghost lights and stuff like that, is they will try to lead you away. Now, I had been warned that on this island, I don't remember seeing one, but I didn't, like I said, I didn't explore that much. I had only about an hour before sundown, that there were open graves in the cemetery and stuff like that. So I didn't want to go wandering out in the dark in the middle of the cemetery. Who knows what would happen? And I said, is this thing trying to lead me out into the, deeper into the cemetery? I don't like that idea, because that's not good. Because according to legend, ghost lights will try to lead you to your death. They will try to lead you or get you lost in things. So it's a good idea if you ever see a light in the forest like that. Don't entertain the thought of trying to follow it or go find it, because that might be a trick you don't want to mess with. So that thought crossed my mind when this was happening. I said, is this thing trying to lead me deeper into this cemetery and all that? God only knows what else is out there, you know? So I said, I spoke to it. I said, no, I'm not going to play your game. I'm not going to follow you out there. You come to me. But it wouldn't. It never would come to me. It never would approach. It would come like a little bit closer and then go away. It was just swaying, like whatever it was, you know. And I'm thinking, is there somebody else on this island besides me playing tricks with me here, doing stuff? Did my friends come back to do this to me? But I would have heard the boat, you know. I would have heard them, you know. I would, you know. They think I felt for sure, 100%, I was alone on the island. Or was I really alone? Because there was something else there, definitely, with me that night. And here's the freaky thing, and I've talked about this before. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, things began to die down. Okay, the shadows began to cease a little bit more. The footsteps stopped, the whispering stopped, and the fog slowly began to dissipate. And it might have took it about an hour to go back across the water. And about this time, daylight, the sun started coming up, which I was very happy to see. And yeah, it was one of my most favorite sunrises I think I've ever had experienced. But
Wow.
the weird thing, and you know, the weird thing about all this, right before sunset, the lake loons began to, and that's a very, very eerie sound. Lake loons, okay, they are. You may have heard some in your time. Very eerie sound, you know. And I'm thinking, oh, this is the icing on the cake, you know. All this starts up, and it was probably about an hour later, I heard my friend's motorboat coming, you know, and they had, I think they had breakfast before they went to pick me up or something. But anyway, that was the end of the adventure. But it was one of the most freakiest nights I've ever had. And I've thought about it over the years, you know, and having other experiences like that, that there was definitely something there other than me and just my imagination. And whatever it was, I think was trying to communicate with me, whether it was demonic or human or whatever it was trying to, I think, you know, communicate or contact with me somehow or another. and he couldn't do it or wasn't trying to do it that much or whatever the situation was. It was very freaky. But it was one of the most unnerving nights I think I've ever spent in anywhere like that. And I've been in some interesting situations. As a matter of fact, I spent all night alone in an alley that was supposedly haunted by a dead pirate in Charleston, South Carolina. One late one night, all by myself. Nobody else would go with me, so I had to go by myself. But that was freaky too. You know, I had the same kind of experience there, but not on that kind of a scale. Where things, you know, you see stuff or things begin to you hear things and all that. But that was very funny. And if it had just been shadows, I would have said, you know, well, maybe that's my mind, you know, working on that. Maybe that's just, you know, my imagination working overtime or whatever. And I'm going to tell you what, as a writer, I have my imagination in check. I don't usually hallucinate things. I don't usually let my imagination run wild unless I'm trying to write something about it. But that was freaky and very strange. But I felt there was communication. There was one other time like that, Shanty, that I had a very interesting experience like that. And that was in a haunted inn in Charleston, by the way. It was a inn frequented by the pirate Blackbeard. His ghost was supposedly seen there. But that night, I spent the whole night in a sub basement of this tavern that looked like something out of a horror movie. You had to open a trap door to go down in this basement, and I spent the night alone down there. And I sat that night all night. I sat on a 16th century seawall that was part of the city's seawall. This was how old this thing, and it is one of the oldest, still oldest businesses in the United States. It has been there for a very long time. It's a liquor store now, by the way. So I would say that I encountered more than spirits in the bottle in this place because while I was down there in the dark, I felt another presence like that come up to me, and it was very feminine. Matter of fact, I could almost hear like skirts moving, you know, like, you know, a dress or a fabric like that a woman would wear. And I felt kind of, I'm not going to say I actually smelled the perfume, but it was like,
Okay.
yeah, there was a different,
Fragrance.
yeah, thing there. And here's the weird part. It was like it walked up to me and like somebody would take their hand and put it on your cheek for a moment, like brushed me like that. And I said, "This is weird. That's not Blackbeard the pirate." I said, "What is that?" You know. And here's the weird part of it. So I go back, you know, after the end of the investigation. I talked to the owner, and I said, you know, a lot of people have experienced stuff in this basement. And I said, you know, I had a very weird, and I tried to take pictures of it. I tried to get it, you know, note to no avail. And I told the owner about it. And I said, but I didn't tell him exactly what happened. And he said, well, I asked him, I said, what's the history of this basement? Besides it being, you know, Blackbeard and they hid the rum down there or whatever, you know. And he said, well, it's not that much. He said, well, there was one time back in the 18th century when someone murdered about, kind of like the Jack the Ripper thing, murdered about 4 or 5 prostitutes in the city, and they couldn't bury them because it was wintertime. You couldn't dig, and back in the old days, you couldn't dig graves in the winter that much because the ground would be frozen. And they didn't have machinery then like we do now to do that. And so he said that they couldn't bury these ladies, so they you know kept their bodies in the basement for a few weeks. And I'm going, that explains it. You know, the feminine thing, the whatever that was that was down there. Yeah.
Right. Mate, and you know, when you speak about the open graves, and especially of the slaves, right? I mean, when you look at the African and no doubt African American people as well, there's a very huge amount of, there's a big ceremony that goes around burials and funerals and stuff like that. And it, you know, there's a great belief system that goes along with the crossing of the soul and stuff like that. So when that kind of system is there and like open graves of slaves or whatever it's been, I have no doubt that there's been quite a bit of dark or negative, you know, energy and creating seriously negative entities in that area. But it's interesting that they didn't try and harm you. You know, that for me is always, so it almost to me is someone trying to get your attention rather than trying to hurt you or harm you or scare you off the
Well,
planet type of thing.
it's been my experience, Shanty, that when you ever investigate a place like that or go into it, it kind of disturbs things. Okay, that may be there for a while, and if you stay there a while, a lot of people don't understand. You see this on TV, the ghost hunting goes on and all that. It is you don't see the real boring part of it all, where you sit in a room for 4 or 5 hours without anything, waiting for something to happen. Uh, you don't see that part of it because it's that's how that's television in Hollywood. But I think, and it's been my experience, that when you go into that environment, you disturb it. And once you stay there a while, it's almost like they get used to you or you become part of that environment. You will experience more, which I think is
Right.
what happened to me that night. Yeah. And the reason, I'm going to tell you this, though, the reason that I heard later that there were maybe one or two or three open graves, that people had actually stolen, bones out of this and had done rituals and
I mean,
dark
that's
witchcraft.
weird.
Yeah. Satanic
That's so
stuff out
weird.
there. Yeah.
So if they're already doing that there, and if there's a lot of, as you say, satanic stuff going on there, it would make sense. But, I also agree with what Cyanne's saying. Yeah. I've also seen a lot of lost souls, if you want to call it that, right? And a lot of the time I find that they are reaching out, they want something. They want the light. They want to go back to the light. Mm-hmm. And I find that, and that's why for me, what you're saying is very interesting, because it wasn't like they didn't try and scare you or harm you and hurt you in any way. They made their presence known for sure, right? But not in a harmful or destructive way. That to me is always a good sign. Because, of course, there are trapped souls, lost souls, and some of them are not evil, right? They just don't know how to get back home.
It's a possibility, though, but, that's what disturbed me, if there had been some kind of satanic rite that had taken place on that island. And unfortunately, people do that in certain areas like this. You can also open doorways to some of this bad stuff. That's a lot of part of some of the satanic rituals and ceremonies they do for that. But I felt kind of like what happened that night. Like I said, they were trying to, somebody knew something different that they wanted to check out. I was in their environment and it was something different then. And I think that's the feeling. Yeah, that's the feeling I come away with on that. That, they were just curious. They were very curious about me and wanted to see what I was up to, I think. But it was freaky. But that is something. And here's another aspect of it all that I've considered over the years. And I've done a lot of studies on this, that there are certain lakes and large bodies of water that people say are cursed, that they have a curse, and that ancient peoples used to believe, a lot of, especially this happened in Africa, it happened in South America, in different places. People on occasion, especially that lived around lakes and ponds and bodies of water, would periodically sacrifice things to this water to appease the spirits in the water. And I've often wondered about that, because there were whole towns under this water. People's lives and memories were buried under this water, deep in this water that was there. And these things may remain behind in certain sense, and the ancient people believed that there were spirits that lived in the water, that the lake itself, the water was a spirit, and they had to, every periodically sacrifice to it. Unfortunately, it was sometimes human sacrifices that would do that. And I have actually had people say, the lake is hungry and it's not looking for another, and said that everything goes along fine. I know this is very cold and callous to think about, but people say this, that if they, every now and then there's a drowning, somebody is, sacrificed to the water, whether accidentally or what, the lake is happy with that, or the lake will remain, placated by that. And that's kind of unsettling to think about, that they're not only spirits on land, but there may be spirits in the water that,
Totally.
maybe trying
I
to
mean,
also communicate with you.
well, it makes sense because, for those of us been listening to Jesse's shows, she speaks a lot about the water spirits, the underground cities and, underwater cities. And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the water body is huge and it carries energy 4 times faster than what air does. So it's a great conductor of sound, energy, etc. Right? So it would make sense to me that there are different portals, entry points. I don't know if you call a Stargate something in the sea, but that it's like doorways, basically, where different entities are going to be moving in and out. They're not all bad, though, I don't believe, obviously. But the whole water, that's a whole ecosystem on its own.
Water,
The marine
water is
system.
very spiritual. It's very
Yeah,
spiritual. Yeah.
absolutely. As a woman, 80% of your body is water, and as a man, probably about 72%. So water is the emotional element as well. It's the feminine element on the planet. It's flowing, it's moving. And,
A lot of lakes. A lot of
mm,
lakes are named after women, by the way. It's just interesting too to think about. But
yeah,
people believe that without doubt that these bodies of water have spirits. That is an elemental type spirit we're talking
yeah,
about. It's sort of like that, yeah. And they believed that they had to keep it happy. And they did this with volcanoes. You see this in, very big ceremonial ritual they do in Hawaii sometimes. These are deep in cultures, and in Africa, they have been known to do sacrifices like this to the mountains, like
yeah,
Kilimanjaro and all that. Yeah, mountaintops are very liminal places, just like lakes and crossroads and cemeteries. The liminal, they are very spiritual. They are very apt to be a place where you would definitely encounter some type of spiritual doorway or opening into the veil, so to speak, between
right.
worlds. Yeah.
Wow, it's super interesting.
But
It really
I will
is.
tell everybody this, if when you walk between worlds like I did that night, definitely freaky, weird stuff's going to happen. You're going to have you're going to have an interesting experience, put it that way. But I went seeking for it, looking for it, and was not disappointed. Definitely not by that. But you never know what you will encounter in these places. You have to be on, I'm not going to say on your guard, but be on your game because you never know what what situation may rise because these are places that are definitely out of the normal, the paranormal, I say definitely without a doubt because that's just the way they are, and especially mountaintops are very well known for this. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Kilimanjaro is an extinct volcano or something like that. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So that was a force of nature. Volcanoes, they could destroy your world in a big hurry. And just ask the people of Pompeii; they know all about that. But that's another place I've always wanted to investigate, Pompeii, because that place would have to be haunted to the high heavens. So many people perished there in such a horrific, traumatic instant. You know, that would be definitely a place of spirits, without a doubt.
And the land remembers, the land has a memory. She has a consciousness, the earth. So she remembers, and she remembers everyone who's tread on
Mm-hmm.
her. So
The,
it's,
the water is like that too, Shanty. The water remembers. It's been proven by science that water has memory. And look at how much around us has water in it or is made with water and all that stuff. Uh, I believe without a doubt, memories can be implanted in places and things and like rocks, mountains, streams, and water, stuff like that. Without a doubt, they could retain memories, especially if
oh,
it's a traumatic
rock,
memory
rocks,
of
especially.
yeah.
I mean, if you look at rocks, the body, the earth and the human body are not very different. The rocks of the earth are like the bones
Mm-hmm.
of the human body, right? The rocks have been here for the longest time. And remember, everything carries consciousness. So
They would
those
have
rocks
more
have
memories. Yeah,
experienced,
they would definitely have more memories. Yeah, because
they
they've
have
been.
experienced the transition of this earth, who knows how many times, right? So it's amazing, you know, when we start seeing the earth in that way, we can start respecting the earth in a different way, to understand it as an ancient body of awareness and consciousness and memories. And all we have to do is tap into that. Because even though generations of all people have been wiped out and killed, and we know what has happened, right, to try and eradicate the human race over time. But the earth remembers. And when we connect to nature and the earth, we will be reminded. We know it's like those memories are therefore triggered within us, because our soul is also eternal. We've also been around forever, right? So you remember the memories of whatever we need is within your nervous system. It's within the cells of your body. So we just got to
I was
tune
going
in.
to relate one incident that happened to me on a spiritual research thing I was doing. It was at someone's house. It was at this lady's house, and um, she and I were the only ones in the house at that time. And I was setting up equipment because there had been a lot of paranormal activity going on in this house. And the woman was very frightened by it. And that's the one thing I always try to do. I try to get, help people to have an understanding of what's going on, what may be happening here in this situation, try to keep people from being fearful, nervous about it and all that. And because that negativity tends to increase a lot of this activity sometimes because it reacts off of that. That's why I tell people, keep your vibrations high, don't go low, because low is the bad and high is the good, the way to look at it. But I was setting this equipment up in a hallway, and I'll never will forget this. This is a very interesting incident. And there had been reports of shadows in this house. And what I was setting up was a laser blanket. In other words, it's a blanket laser that goes down the hallway to try to I was trying to film an actual shadow, if I could, which would have been really good, really neat. And I had setting up a camera, and I was getting ready to put the laser blanket down the hallway. And it was a very long hallway, and it had like it's in the middle of this house, and it's got rooms on each side of it. And I'm setting this up, and the lady that owned the house, she was in the kitchen. She was making us some coffee, because it was going to be a long night. I was by myself, and she and I were going to stay up all night, like I did on the island, and stay up. You're going in for the long haul, And so I was setting this camera up, and I remember it well. I'm setting it up, and I was getting ready to put the blanket down the hall to try to catch that. And down the very end of the hall, it was not brightly lit. Okay, but I could still see because there was a light behind me shining down the hall, and I could see the hall. I could see the picture on the wall, the very end of the hall and all that. And while I'm looking down the hall, Shanty, this lady comes out of the room. And I seen her, I could see her. She was an elderly lady. She had kind of like long white hair, and she was wearing a floral print like house coat type thing, And she crosses the hall and goes in the other room over there. And I'm going, well, who is that? I mean, it didn't occur to me what I was seeing was a full-bodied apparition. Okay. And I said, well, who is that? Who else is in this house? So I immediately go to the kitchen and say, is there somebody else in this house you didn't tell me about? She said, no, it's just you and me. I said, well, wait a minute, I saw somebody just now. She said, well, who did you see? I said, I don't know. I told her it was an elderly lady. She had on she had long white hair, kind of, her hair was down. And I said, she had like a floral print house coat. She said, and all of a sudden the woman's face drained. She said, my God, that was my mother. She died in that room 5 years ago.
Wow.
I wish I'd have got that on camera.
The thing is, the ghosts don't let you film them, though. That's the thing. You don't often see them. That's what I've been told, anyway. Is that true?
Well, she was as solid as you are. I mean, she looked real. I didn't know what I was looking at was an apparition. She looked so real. I mean, she was solid looking. You couldn't see anything through her or anything. She was solid.
Wow. That's incredible. But it also just shows us, we're not alone. And yeah, it's amazing, actually, Dennis, what you've experienced. And I find, especially, the first story you were telling, just going back to that, about, I think that's actually quite amazing how they, something in them must have recognized that you're okay, those spirits initially, and that you spoke to them, they responded, and I love that, actually, because I do think that's the way to deal with interdimensional connections. I'm not scared of them.
A lot of so-called hauntings, I think, are time slips. I mean, they're just doing what they always did. What you're doing is, I think, you're like seeing a snapshot of time to a certain extent. That's what we would call a residual haunting. It's just sort of like that memory left behind there in that area. They're just playing over and over again. They never recognize you being there and you seeing them, but they never see you, kind of a thing. Or sometimes they will see, but that is an actual haunting if there's an interaction going on. What I might have seen was a residual type thing because she didn't pay any attention to me. And she later on, I asked the lady, I said, was your mother died in that room that she come out of? She said, yeah. But she was her favorite place was the living room, which is the room she went in. That was where her recliner was that she's always stayed in, and that was just like she would be going from point A to point B. That makes sense when you think about it, yeah.
Sure.
But it was like a memory playing over again,
For sure. That's amazing, man. Wow. Interesting.
But that's the holy grail of spirit research, to see a full-bodied apparition.
Right.
That's freaky. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting on our farm, on my mom's side, okay, they had on their farm was the last living bushman, right, that lived on their farm, and this is when my mom was a kid, okay, and he had a dog, and he was always there. And whenever my grandmother, because my grandfather was in the war and he was away, so whenever my mom and my grandmother came home from town, he would open the gate for her, right? That was what he did. And then he passed away, and he's actually still buried on the farm in one of their very special graves there. But my grandmother, who was a seer, okay, very, very good seer, she maintained, I was not there, okay, my mother backs her up, that every time my grandmother came home from town at night, and she was alone, and the farm gate had to be opened, this guy and his and his dog were always there opening the gate for my grandmother, and also in solid form. And he would greet her and she would greet him. But because she was very au fait with, what do you call it, seeing between the veils or beyond the veils, right, was nothing strange for her at all. I remember she would tell us that story a lot, and I was always very, very fascinated by that. I've never had that. I must be honest. I've never had that, but I've definitely had some very real experiences for sure. But I find that very interesting.
That is. That's I was interviewed at a magazine not long ago, and they asked me a very interesting question. They said, after, and I've been doing this for like 60 plus some odd years now, and they said, what is one conclusion, Dr. Carroll, that you've come out with on this? I said, well, there's one thing I can definitely tell you without a doubt, that death is not the end. I think it's just the beginning. I think it's just where it started.
Journey. Yeah. Absolutely, And, your body is a temporary vehicle, but it is such an important vehicle, because your body, through your body, you express the purpose of your spirit or your soul. So we have to treat our bodies well.
Absolutely.
We have to see them as the manifestation of your soul in physical form. Really do, because that's what it is.
I call the body a container. The body is the container for your spirit, without doubt. Really, you are a living soul. A lot of people get that wrong. they think spirit and soul are, the same thing. Not really,
Yeah.
because you are a living soul, but you have a spirit.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
do, yeah. But
And your spirit is connected to God. So it's like coming down, soul
I
and the
think
body.
I
Yeah.
think everything, Shanty, that is a living thing, or a living soul, if you want to put it that way, has a spirit. And my dog, I have a very beloved dog that has been gone now for about 2 years, and I swear, honest, every now and then I feel him with me.
Mm,
I feel him just not long ago, like he jumped on the bed where I was at. You have to wonder, what lies beyond that veil, and how these things can still be there to communicate with you in some form or fashion. Uh, I
mm.
feel like that what we are living in are dimensions, different
Yeah,
dimensions.
total
You know,
dimensions, yeah.
it's not like when you die that you're gone and that's it forever. I believe it's like you step over into another existence beyond what we're at now, and yet those still very close together in some ways. In certain places, that happens as well. In certain situations, you can touch that veil and what lies on the other side of it, and it's never far away from us. To
Yeah.
that end, yeah. And
Interesting.
I think love can transcend that veil to a certain extent. Things that have that attachment between places. I have had that happen. A lot of cases I could tell you about where that has happened, like a grandfather that died in the field that kept trying to come back home, and his grandchildren would see him out in the field, and they had never even known him, but they recognized, they showed him a picture later on. Hey, that's the man in the field. And so that night I went out there and spoke to him. I said, look, he had died in an accident, farm accident out in that field. Tractor, turned over on him and he had died. And the last thing he had been trying to do was get out from under that tractor and get back home. So I went out there in that field that night and I spoke to him. I called him by name and I said, look, you don't have to worry about coming back home now. You need to go on to where else you need to go, and everybody here is okay, and they know where you're at, and they know you don't have to worry about coming back home anymore. You need to go on. They call this a kind of a soul rescue. You
Yeah.
tell these people they may be confused, or they're bound by some kind of tie or something to keep trying to come back. And after that night, he was never seen in that field again.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I've also experienced that a lot. And pretty much, yeah, help them into the light if they choose. Very
Mm-hmm.
interesting, but there are definitely some earth, and I found a lot with what I've seen and worked with. Often when it's shock, often when it's a shock, like a unexpected death or a violent death, or if someone, especially even if they're old, they don't believe in the afterlife. They don't. It's like that's when the spirits will often remain stuck, in my experience. So,
birth is a big shock. Death definitely would have to be something along those same lines too. It is not only a physical shock, but a spiritual shock to you as well, I'm sure, especially if you die traumatically, like in an accident or something like that, or whatever the situation. Definitely that would have to have its own kind of criteria attached to it. Definitely.
For sure.
But
for sure. A lot of them don't know they're even dead. Some of them don't even know they're dead. Well, in fact, probably all of them. No, some of them do know they are. But there are many that actually don't know they are dead. So they wander around thinking, and that's what I found what hauntings are, actually. A lot of the hauntings are when you're hearing things fall and stuff like that, because they get frustrated. They can't understand why they can't be seen anymore, or they're being ignored or stuff like that. So, and the more angry or frustrated they get, remember their vibration lowers. So they become more, and they become more.
They may be operating. They may be operating under a different consciousness too. Their consciousness may be different after death than it is during life. And like we said earlier, the body is just a container for that. And if they're confused or don't understand what's going on with that, I could see that, being a situation as well. But I agree
Yeah.
with you, definitely that that might be part of what's going on with that. But I think they're under, your consciousness may take on a different form as well in that situation. We don't know really. Nobody comes back to tell you a whole lot about that, but that is an interesting facet of it.
Yeah.
That could be like that. Yeah. But what's funny over all the years, I talk to people about these things. I don't believe in that kind of stuff. I don't believe that. But let me tell you what happened to me. I always say that, And so there is a weird thing about that, Shanny. People want to believe and yet they don't want to believe.
Yeah, for sure. So true. Confused, but that's part of the journey of life, is that we rediscover who we really are. And that's amazing, through some very tough times. And we're right in the thick of it now, aren't we? So yay, we're all doing this together. Dennis, thank you so much again for joining me. It's always great fun and a pleasure to have you on Aquarius Rising Africa. Thank you so, so much. And is there anything that you maybe just want to share with our viewers? Where you at? What are you doing? Any of your great shows coming up this week while I look for your banner and pop it up?
Yes, I just did a good show last night on vampires and cannibalism on my network. Hunting the Shadows YouTube podcast channel. Check us out over there. And membership's open if you want to join or just subscribe. And we have shows on Wednesday nights at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And on Friday night, same time, 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I got a new show I've started up, which is on Monday mornings at 11 a.m. called Monday Morning Monsters. We talk nothing but cryptids. Yeah, wall-to-wall cryptids.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and we started that up, and that's going to be on Monday mornings on Hunting the Shadows. And if you, I also have a paranormal consultation service. If you have, some problems, or you just want to talk about, you want to tell me a story, whatever, you can get in contact with me at denniswcarroll.com, which is my website, or you can email me at denniswcarroll@gmail.com. And I have some books available on Barnes, as you've got some of them, on Barnes and Noble and Amazon. Just look up the author, Dennis W. Carroll.
Cool. Well, all your details are scrolling below. So for those of you and thank you, Lisa D, for popping this up. I appreciate you. And yay, guys. Well, then I will see you. Probably not tomorrow, because I need to take my mother to the airport. And it's at an awkward time of the day, so I have to just move things around a bit. But I will see you guys next week again. So thank you so very much for joining me again. And Dr. Dennis, always have great conversations and about the spooky things out there. So yeah, just stay centered, stay strong, stay cool, and stay aligned, and you ain't got no problem. Thank you, Dennis. Take good care. God bless you, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, guys. Mwah.